She was banished while pregnant. Her twins returned as the strongest alphas. The harvest invocation was supposed to be the most sacred day of her reign. It was meant to be a day of feasting, of golden fires, and spoken vows of prosperity for the coming harsh winter. Instead, it became the moment Aveline Thorne's entire world shattered. Everything turned to ash. The sprawling, cavernous main hall of the Northern Keep was built specifically to humble the weak. A brutal, unforgiving expanse of black iron and jagged, unpolished stone. Its vaulted ceilings were lost in perpetual shadows, supported by massive pillars carved to resemble the great, ancestral wolves of the founding era. Their stone eyes seemed to glare down in silent judgment, their fangs bared in a permanent, silent snarl that warned against any act of treason. The heavy, stained glass windows, usually glowing with the warm, amber light of the setting sun, were currently choked by a ferocious, unnatural blizzard. Frost crawled across the intricate glass panes, obscuring the colourful depictions of old victories and leaving only a stark grey twilight to illuminate the trial. The air inside the vast chamber tasted of crushed pine, cold iron, and the sharp bite of freezing rain. It was the bitter, relentless chill that seeped mercilessly through the thin soles of Aveline's embroidered silk slippers, creeping up her ankles and settling deep into the marrow of her bones. She had been dragged from her chambers before dawn, allowed no time to don a heavier cloak. The thin silk offered zero barrier against the biting draught that swept across the elevated stone dais. The heavy iron chains draped across the executioner's dais clinked softly in the draught, a steady, metallic rhythm that underscored the severe gravity of the trial. Every scrape of link against stone sounded like a ticking clock, counting down the final seconds of her life as Luna. She stood perfectly still in the center of the raised platform. Her spine was a rod of forged steel. Her breathing was meticulously controlled, shallow and silent, betraying absolutely zero panic to the predators circling her. The assembled nobles whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes wide with a sick, hungry fascination. They wanted a show, they wanted tears, but Aveline would give them nothing. Her silver eyes, the rare genetic marker of a bloodline long thought extinct, were beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. Unwavering, they were lethal in their absolute calm. They remained locked entirely on the sovereign seated above her, Gideon Vance, the Alpha King of the North, her husband, her fated mate. He did not look like the man who had whispered desperate prayers against her skin the night before. The man who had buried his face in her neck and sworn that she was his only salvation. He sat rigid upon the massive iron throne, his broad, terrifyingly powerful shoulders tense under the immense weight of his dark fur mantle. His storm-grey eyes, which usually softened only for her, were completely dilated. They were clouded with an unnatural, sickly film that turned his irises into opaque, dead glass. The audience of assembled nobles, clustered in the shadows like waiting vultures in their silks and velvets, could not see the micro-tremors vibrating through his massive hands. They did not notice the way his knuckles had gone completely white as he gripped the armrests, the ancient stone cracking slightly under his sheer force. His own flesh was fighting a silent, agonizing war against a chemical invasion. Aveline saw it. She felt it. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding in real time. It was not a metaphorical pain. It was a sudden, violent physical agony that punched all the oxygen from her lungs, causing the blood in her veins to turn to sludge. A cold, freezing ache aggressively replaced the burning gold of their fated connection, spreading a phantom frost through her chest where his warmth used to reside. The sensation was biological, an absolute severing of cellular recognition that made her vision swim with dark, suffocating spots. To the left of the Iron Throne stood Sibylla Frost. The usurper Duchess wore an immaculate gown of midnight velvet, her sharp, aristocratic face beautiful in the way a winter frost was beautiful. She was lethal, quiet, and completely devoid of mercy. Her pale blue eyes tracked every micro-expression on the king's face, cold and calculating, measuring the exact dosage of her treachery. A faint, cloying scent radiated from the older woman, cutting sharply through the ambient chill of the grand hall. Poisoned honey and decaying lavender. It was the distinct olfactory signature of the soul fracture potion. The dark, viscous liquid had been slipped into the king's morning tea under the guise of a restorative tonic. Was specifically designed to mimic the biological sensation of a dying mate bond, violently forcing his inner beast to perceive his true mate as a deadly, encroaching threat. Gideon's human mind was suffocating beneath the oppressive weight of the usurper's venom, drowning in an orchestrated paranoia he could neither articulate nor fight. He would not know it now, but years later, that specific, sickeningly sweet scent of poisoned honey and decaying lavender would become the very trigger that shattered his delusions, turning his stomach and driving him mad with absolute regret. The silence in the vast chamber stretched, brittle and freezing, pulling taut like a bowstring meant to execute a queen. Sibylla stepped forward, her heels clicking against the stone in a sharp, predatory cadence. In her pale, ringed hands, she held a thick parchment bound in crimson leather, the forged ledger, the physical manifestation of a carefully orchestrated lie. It detailed false treason, non-existent poisonings, and a fabricated conspiracy to open the northern borders to the rogue armies, all bearing Aveline's flawlessly forged seal. Aveline did not even glance at the book. She knew exactly what it was. She knew that arguing against it was entirely useless. The trap had been set weeks ago, slowly tightening, while she had been distracted by the sudden, overwhelming physiological changes in her own body. Her body. Beneath the thin, freezing silk of her gown, Aveline's hand twitched, driven by a primal, desperate instinct to press flat against her lower abdomen. She forced her fingers to remain curled rigidly at her sides. Her nails bit so deeply into her palms that she felt the warm, wet slide of her own blood. It was the only thing keeping her grounded. The physical sting kept her breathing. She was exactly 1 month pregnant. She had only discovered the truth 3 days ago. A subtle shift in her scent, masked heavily by the natural pine and ozone of the northern altitudes. The faint, rapid flutter of not one, but 2 secondary heartbeats echoing against the protective walls of her ribs. Twins. She carried the next generation of the Valdron monarchy in the absolute dark, waiting for this very harvest invocation to share the joyous news with her fated mate. Instead, her fated mate was currently drowning in a sea of chemically induced paranoia, his dilated eyes staring at her as if she were a rabid beast meant for the slaughter. A heavy silver pendant rested against Aveline's collarbone, the Winterbane crest. It had been Gideon's first gift to her, a sacred marker of his protection and his absolute devotion. No cold shall touch you while my heart beats, he had sworn in the dark of their nesting room, pressing his lips to the heavy silver wolf etched into the metal. Now, the metal felt like a brand of dry ice against her skin. It was leaching the warmth directly from her veins, a physical reminder of the void where his soul used to touch hers. The evidence is irrefutable, my king. Sibylla's voice rang out, melodic and completely devoid of soul. It was a voice designed to slice through the ambient draft, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings so that every noble in the assembly could hear. The Luna has conspired against the crown. She has traded Valdron's secrets to the southern rogues. Her treason has endangered the very foundation of your reign. Whispers erupted from the shadows. The nobles of the court, dressed in their opulent furs and thick velvets, leaned forward like starving hounds scenting blood. They had never liked her. Aveline Thorn came from a lineage deemed extinct, a bloodline of quiet survival and ancient unspoken magic that made the modern, politically ambitious Pax deeply uncomfortable. She was too quiet, too observant. She did not play their games of flattery and poisoned wine, and they hated her for it. Treason, a lord muttered in the front row. Execution, hissed a lady draped in white mink. Aveline ignored them all. She kept her chin parallel to the stone floor, her silver eyes remaining locked entirely on the king. Look at me. She screamed the words in the silent, hollowed-out cavern of her mind. Look at me and see through the rot. His beast was heavily sedated, buried alive beneath the oppressive weight of the treacherous elixir. Gideon shifted on the iron throne, the massive chains of his own regalia clinking harshly. When he finally spoke, the sound did not belong to the man who loved her. It was a brutal, grating sound, like two heavy stones grinding against each other in the dark. Aveline Thorne. Her name from his lips felt like a physical blow. The absolute lack of the mate bond resonance in his tone was staggering. Usually, when he spoke her name, a golden hum would vibrate through her marrow, a biological reassurance of absolute safety. Now there was only the metallic, dead echo of a stranger. "You stand accused of high treason," Gideon continued, his jaw locking so tightly that the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. The micro-tremors in his hands were worsening. The stone armrests of his throne began to crumble into grey dust under his grip, the deep, instinctual part of his brain. The ancient wolf that recognized its true mate was violently clawing at the chemical cage Sibylla had built, but it was losing the battle. The poisoned honey scent in the air grew thicker, cloying and suffocating. The punishment for treason against the sovereign fortress is death. The hall fell into a terrifying, breathless silence. The blizzard outside howled, throwing handfuls of ice against the stained glass, threatening to shatter the windows entirely. Aveline did not flinch. She did not weep. She stood like a statue carved from winter itself. "He is going to kill me," she thought. The realization was completely detached from panic. It was a cold, absolute fact. Her hand twitched again, the maternal instinct roaring to life, demanding she shift, demanding she tear through the guards to protect the unformed lives inside her. Gideon squeezed his eyes shut for a fraction of a second. A bead of cold sweat tracked down his temple. The chemical war in his blood was reaching a critical threshold. However, the Alpha King gritted out, every syllable sounding as if it were being violently extracted from his throat. "I will not spill the blood of the woman who once warmed my bed. You are stripped of your title. You are stripped of your pack. I reject this bond. I banish you from this royal citadel to the freezing wastes of the Whispering Woods. You will leave immediately. If you are seen within Valdron borders by dawn, you will be executed without trial." The words dropped like heavy lead anvils into the icy air. "I reject this bond." The finality of the statement was a biological catastrophe. The sacred thread connecting their souls did not just stretch or bleed this time. It violently snapped. Aveline gasped, a short, sharp inhalation of pure, unfiltered agony as the metaphysical tether ripped away from her heart. It felt as though a jagged, rusted hook had been buried in her chest and violently yanked out, taking half her soul with it. She swayed on her feet, the world tilting precariously as black spots danced across her vision. Her wolf whimpered, a pathetic dying sound in the dark recesses of her consciousness, before curling into a tight, silent ball of grief. "It is done," Sibylla whispered softly, a triumphant smirk curving her blood-red lips. The assembled court waited. They waited for the breakdown. They expected the former Luna of Valdron to fall to her knees, to claw at the stone, to beg her king for mercy, for a lesser sentence, for her life. No Omega could survive the severing of a fated bond without completely losing their mind to the grief. No one survived the cursed forest in the dead of winter. It was a death sentence, merely disguised as mercy. She did not break. Aveline anchored herself in the agonizing void of her chest. She focused entirely on the faint, nearly imperceptible double heartbeat drumming beneath her ribs. They were her survival. They were the only future that mattered now. Slowly, meticulously, Aveline drew in a deep breath of the freezing, pine-scented air. She straightened her posture until she was standing taller than she ever had as a queen. She reached up to her throat with steady, untrembling fingers. She unclasped the Winterbane crest. The heavy silver pendant pooled in her palm, completely stripped of its warmth. She did not throw it. She did not hurl it in a fit of melodramatic rage. She simply stepped forward and placed the silver wolf gently onto the cold stone floor of the dais, a quiet, terrifyingly final sound. "I accept your rejection, King Gideon," Aveline said. Her voice was perfectly even. It did not shake. It carried no tears, no hysteria, and no begging. It was the calm, lethal quiet of a frozen lake right before the ice breaks. Gideon flinched, a violent, full-body flinch, as if she had struck him across the jaw with an iron gauntlet. His striking, tempestuous gaze widened slightly, the dead glass film cracking for just a fraction of a second, as the sheer dignity of her voice penetrated the poison. He leaned forward, his mouth parting, a strangled, confused sound catching in his throat. Sibylla was already moving, gesturing sharply to the elite guards. "Escort the traitor to the gates now. Do not touch me." Aveline's command was not loud, but it carried a dense, ancestral authority that made the two approaching guards freeze in their tracks. The ancient magic in her Thorn bloodline, the dormant power she had always kept carefully hidden so as not to outshine her mate, flared briefly in her silver eyes. The guards instinctively lowered their gazes, stepping back. She turned her back on the Iron Throne. She turned her back on the usurper Duchess, on the whispering, vulture-like nobles, and on the man she had loved more than her own life. Every step she took down the length of the cavernous main hall was measured and deliberate. The thin silk slippers offered no protection against the freezing stone, but she did not rush. The crowd parted for her, stepping back into the shadows, unnerved by the absolute silence of her departure. A name unspoken grows teeth, and the silence she left in her wake was already gnawing at the foundations of the room. The heavy iron doors of the keep loomed ahead. Standing before them was Riker Blackwood, the border warden. His thick, fur-lined armor was dusted with snow from his previous patrol, his hand resting heavily on the release lever of the gates. Riker was an honor-bound soldier, a veteran who had fought alongside Gideon and who knew the true heart of the Luna. As she approached, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. He didn't see a traitor. He saw the woman who had sat by his wife's bedside during the winter fever, bathing her brow when the royal healers had refused to venture into the lower wards. Riker's eyes met hers. There was a deep, agonizing sorrow in his gaze. He could not defy a direct order from the Alpha King without initiating a bloodbath, but he refused to completely abandon his honor. When Aveline passed him, Riker bowed his head, a gesture of absolute, unwavering respect that sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the perimeter guards. "The woods are unforgiving tonight, my Luna," Riker murmured, his voice pitched so low that only her wolf-enhanced hearing could catch it. As he reached to push the heavy iron mechanism, he subtly let his thick woolen mantle slide from his shoulder, leaving it draped over the iron latch right at eye level. A silent offering. "Follow the eastern ridge. There is a hunter's blind 3 miles out. Survive." Aveline did not pause, nor did she speak a word that might implicate him. But as she stepped past the gate mechanism, her hand shot out, seamlessly grabbing the heavy woolen cloak. Her numb, frost-bitten fingertips brushed against the thick, coarse wool, instantly absorbing the trapped, blistering heat of the warden's body. A violent, saving contrast to the marrow-deep chill of the iron gates. The residual warmth from the warden's body was a tiny, vital shield against the encroaching death, pulling her back from the precipice of immediate hypothermia. She pulled it tightly over her trembling shoulders. The heavy iron doors of the keep groaned open, revealing the ferocious blizzard. The wind roared into the hall, biting into her exposed skin with the fury of 1,000 needles, extinguishing the nearby torches in a chaotic flurry of sparks and shadows. The darkness of the ancient timberland stretched out beyond the threshold, a lethal, freezing abyss that promised nothing but a silent death. Aveline stepped over the threshold into the storm. She did not look back. Not at the warmth of the hall, not at the usurper Duchess grinning in the shadows, and not at the poisoned king who sat frozen on his throne. The massive doors slammed shut behind her, the resounding boom echoing like a thunderclap across the snowy peaks. The finality of the sound triggered another violent shudder of the severed mate bond, a phantom bleeding that made her stumble into the knee-deep snows. The cold was immediate, absolute, and merciless. It cut through her silk gown in seconds, stinging her face and turning her breath into plumes of thick white smoke. Every step away from the king's stronghold felt like dragging an anchor made of rusted iron. The sacred thread connecting their souls had not just snapped. It had shattered, leaving behind jagged metaphysical shrapnel in her chest. She coughed, a harsh, ragged sound, half expecting to see her own blood splatter against the pristine white snow. There was only the thick, freezing mist of her own breath. The silk slippers she wore were shredded by the jagged ice beneath the snow within the first mile. Aveline left small, blooming roses of dark blood in her wake, but the freezing temperatures quickly numbed the physical pain of her lacerated feet. She pulled the warden's heavy woolen garment tighter around her trembling frame, burying her face into the fur-lined collar to trap her own rapid, shallow breaths. The scent of ozone, ancient pine, and freezing earth filled her lungs. She walked. The blizzard howled through the skeletal trees of the deep frozen pines, tearing at her clothes, desperate to drag her down into the endless white void. The wind sounded like the jeering whispers of the nobles in the grand hall. Treason, execution, Omega. Her wolf whimpered, pacing inside her mind, limping from the catastrophic loss of the mate bond. The space where Gideon's golden, resonant warmth had lived for 3 years was now an open, bleeding crater. A hollow void. Every beat of her heart pumped a phantom freezing ache through her chest. It was the winterbane curse by proxy, the absolute biological devastation of a severed fated tie. Most wolves would have thrown themselves off the nearest cliff to escape the agony. Aveline did not stop. She focused downward. She focused entirely on the faint, rapid double heartbeat drumming beneath her frozen ribs, the twin pups, Kalen and Zephyr. They did not have names yet, but she could already feel their distinct, towering presences in her blood. One felt like the heavy, silent weight of a shadow. The other felt like the chaotic, crackling energy of a storm. They were the next generation of the Valdron monarchy. They were the only future that mattered. "I will not let you die," Aveline whispered to the howling wind, her voice completely swallowed by the storm. "I will not let the cold touch you." Her mind briefly flashed back to the cavernous main hall, to Sibylla's triumphant smirk, to the sickeningly sweet scent of poisoned honey and decaying lavender, the mind-altering elixir. Aveline had read of it in the ancient archives, a forbidden concoction brewed from shadowroot and dark magic, designed to sever a true mate bond by convincing the host's inner beast that its mate was a lethal threat. Gideon was a prisoner in his own mind, heavily sedated by the usurper's poison. He was currently sitting on an iron throne that was slowly crumbling beneath his own uncontrollable strength, completely blind to the fact that he had just condemned his own bloodline to die in the snow. "He will realize it one day," her wolf murmured, a weak, raspy thought, "and the guilt will tear him apart." Aveline did not care about his future guilt. Guilt could not keep a fire burning. Regret could not feed her children. She reached up with a numb, trembling hand, her fingers brushing the bare skin of her collarbone, where the winterbane crest used to rest. The phantom weight of the heavy silver pendant still lingered. Cold and dead, he had sworn no cold would touch her while his heart beat. A lie fabricated by the potion, but a broken promise nonetheless. By the time the 3rd hour passed, her body was shutting down, her vision narrowed to a blurry grey tunnel. The ancient magic in her blood, the dormant, unspoken power of the Thorn lineage, began to stir, fighting back against the encroaching hypothermia. A faint, silver warmth radiated from her core, pushing outward to keep her vital organs functioning, protecting the womb at all costs. It was not enough to keep her comfortable, but it was exactly enough to keep her breathing. 3 miles out, exactly as Riker Blackwood had promised, a jagged silhouette emerged from the blinding white curtain of the blizzard. The hunter's blind. It was a dilapidated, half-sunken wooden structure built against the side of a massive granite boulder. The roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, and the wooden door was hanging off a rusted iron hinge. Aveline practically fell through the threshold. The wind instantly lost its biting edge, blocked by the thick logs and stone. She collapsed onto the dry, dusty dirt floor, her knees hitting the ground with a dull thud. The scent inside was old, stale pine and dried earth. It was empty. It was safe. She crawled into the furthest, darkest corner of the small structure. She pulled her bloodied knees to her chest and wrapped Riker's cloak around herself like a cocoon. The adrenaline of the public trial was finally draining away, leaving behind the crushing, suffocating reality of her exile. The king was lost. The pack had discarded her. The bond was dead. In the absolute silence of the hunter's blind, Aveline finally allowed her physical body to react. She did not weep for Gideon Vance. She did not shed a single tear for the man who had let a usurper duchess poison his mind and steal his crown. Her silver eyes glowed faintly in the pitch-black darkness, wide and unblinking. She pressed both hands flat against her lower stomach. The warmth of the dormant magic pulsed beneath her palms. Her wolf, broken and bleeding, curled itself tightly around the two tiny lives, instinctively preparing for a war that would last for years. We are small things in a world of teeth. But the kingdom of Valdrun would eventually learn that the women they banished to the dark were exactly the ones who learned how to rule it. 7 brutal months passed in the deep frost. The exiled wilderness did not care that a queen walked among its jagged, skeletal pines. The forest was a relentless, freezing predator, indifferent to the heavy, swollen belly that altered Aveline Thorne's center of gravity with every labored step she took across the rough-hewn floorboards of her sanctuary. It was a secluded cabin, hidden deep within the treacherous eastern ravines, built from massive, unyielding timber and packed tightly with frozen moss. Nesta Finch, a rogue healer and exiled midwife, had found Aveline shivering in a dilapidated hunter's blind during her first week of banishment and brought her here. Together, the two women had fortified the small structure against the lethal bite of the northern wind. The only warmth Aveline possessed when she arrived was Riker's patrol cloak, the heavy woolen garment the border warden had secretly left for her. Now, 8 months later, it smelled faintly of the Iron Citadel, of cold iron and dying embers. The scent only sharpened the phantom ache in her chest. Survival had become a mechanical, grinding ritual. Aveline wore heavy, cured animal pelts, stitched together with bone needles, her once immaculate silk gowns a forgotten memory of a dead life. Her hands were violently scarred, calloused, and stained permanently with dirt and dried herbs. She had become something primal. She had become a ghost in the snow. The biological toll of the pregnancy was catastrophic. Shifter pregnancies were inherently violent on the mother's body, demanding massive reserves of magic and caloric energy to forge the dense bones and accelerated musculature of an apex predator. Aveline was carrying too. The twins' secondary heartbeats drummed constantly beneath her ribs, frantic and ravenous, draining the dormant ancient magic from her Thorn bloodline, just to keep the three of them breathing. She was perpetually freezing. Her core temperature had dropped so low that she shivered, despite sitting directly beside the roaring stone hearth. The phantom void in her chest, the jagged crater where her fated mate bond had been violently amputated, throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. Without Gideon's proximity to regulate her shifting hormones and anchor her physical pain, every day was a brutal exercise in sheer endurance. Gideon Vance was lost to her, his mind shattered by Sibylla Frost's insidious toxin, leaving him blind to the treason that had driven his true mate into the dark. On the 3rd day of the 8th month, the sky beyond the cabin's thick wooden shutters turned a bruised, sickly purple. The barometric pressure plummeted so rapidly that Aveline's ears popped, sending a sharp spike of vertigo through her skull. A squall was coming, not just a winter storm, but a true high-country blizzard, the kind that froze the sap inside the trees and suffocated entire packs under mountains of white. The air tasted heavily of ozone and raw iron. Aveline was standing by the heavy oak table, grinding dried willow bark with a heavy stone pestle when the first contraction hit. It did not build slowly. It was a sudden, apocalyptic tearing sensation that started at the base of her spine and violently ripped through her pelvis, forcing the oxygen from her lungs in a harsh, ragged gasp. Aveline dropped the stone pestle. It struck the floorboards with a heavy thud. Her knees buckled. She slammed hard onto the rough wood, her scarred hands instinctively flying to cradle her swollen abdomen beneath the veteran's heavy mantle. The pain was absolute. It was a blinding, white-hot agony that completely eclipsed the ambient warmth of the hearth fire. Her wolf whimpered, thrashing blindly in the dark recesses of her mind, utterly terrified by the premature onset of labor. It was too soon. They were not ready. Outside, the freezing wind began to howl, violently rattling the iron hinges of the cabin doors. She breathed in. She held it. The contraction peaked, holding her body hostage in an iron grip of biological necessity, before slowly receding into a dull, terrifying throb. Aveline did not scream. She forced her spine straight, dragging herself upright by gripping the edge of the heavy table. Nesta Finch emerged from the small adjoining storeroom, her arms full of dried firewood. The older woman took one look at Aveline's pale, sweat-slicked face and dropped the wood. The heavy logs clattered across the floor. Nesta was a woman who had seen the worst of shifter society, her face deeply lined with the harsh realities of exile, but her pale eyes widened in sheer alarm. Moon Goddess, the raspy, aged voice breathed. Nesta crossed the room in 3 rapid strides, her hands moving with practiced, lightning-fast efficiency. "You are early, child. Too early. Help them," Aveline gritted out. Her breathing was a metronomic hiss through clenched teeth. The words were a command, not a plea. Though covered in sweat and shaking in the dim light of a secluded cabin, her voice carried the heavy, undeniable authority of a sovereign. Nesta did not argue. She guided Aveline to the thick pallet of furs near the roaring hearth, easing the agonizing mother onto her back. The midwife shrugged off her heavy leather satchel, ripping it open to pull out bundles of dried herbs and tightly sealed glass vials. "If you push now, your heart will stop. You are freezing from the inside out." Aveline bit down hard on the heavy leather collar of the protective wool fabric, the taste of old iron and copper instantly flooding her mouth as her teeth pierced her own lip. She stared blankly at the heavy timber ceiling, her silver eyes glowing faintly, locking all her agony behind a wall of impenetrable, frozen stoicism. Nesta pulled a handful of pale, papery strips from her satchel. Lunar birch bark. It was a rare, highly potent analgesic that only grew in the highest, most lethal altitudes of the northern peaks. She quickly packed a dented iron cup with snow from a bucket by the door, set it directly over the glowing embers of the hearth, and dropped the bark into the melting water. "Drink this," Nesta ordered minutes later, pressing the scorching iron rim to Aveline's bleeding lips. "It will numb the tearing. It will keep your wolf from panicking." Aveline swallowed the boiling, bitter liquid without flinching. It tasted like ash and ozone. Almost instantly, a heavy, numbing cold spread outward from her stomach, temporarily muting the violent, white-hot spikes of the contractions. It did not stop the labor, but it gave her back control of her own muscles. The searing ache of the severed, fated mate bond dimmed, replaced entirely by the primal, biological urge to bring her pups into the world. "I am going to need you to push," Nesta said, her voice entirely stripped of bedside manner. It was the voice of a survivor speaking to another survivor. "The first one is crowning. He is massive." Aveline braced her heavy boots against the stone lip of the hearth. She gripped the thick furs beneath her, digging her fingers so deeply into the pelts that her nails cracked. She pushed. The physical mechanics of the birth were a blur of blood, sweat, and primal instinct. The cabin echoed with the harsh, ragged sound of Aveline's breathing, but she never screamed. She refused to give the pain a voice. The void in her chest pulsed, a phantom biological alarm, screaming that her mate was missing, that she was unprotected, that she was vulnerable to the predators in the woods. She violently silenced the instinct. She was her own anchor now. She was the shield. "Almost," Nesta coaxed, her hands slick with blood in the warm, flickering light. "One more. Break the ice, Mother. Bring him through." With a final, earth-shattering surge of physical force, the first twin was born. There was no immediate crying. Instead, a heavy, suffocating pressure instantly filled the small cabin. The shadows dancing on the timber walls seemed to detach themselves, leaning inward, gravitating toward the tiny, writhing form in Nesta's hands. The air grew instantly colder. The damp edges of the wooden floorboards frosted over. Nesta gasped, nearly dropping the infant. "What is this?" Aveline pushed herself up onto her elbows, her silver eyes locking onto her firstborn, Kaelin. The boy was covered in blood and amniotic fluid, but his eyes were already open. They were wide, unblinking pools of pure, molten silver, an exact replica of his mother's ancient lineage. The shadows clung to his tiny skin like a second blanket, viscous and cold. He did not weep. He simply watched the dark. Before Nesta could fully process the anomaly, the fourth contraction hit Aveline, more violent and erratic than all the others combined. The cabin itself seemed to shudder. The thick oak logs groaned under a sudden immense atmospheric pressure. "The second is coming," Nesta shouted over a sudden, inexplicable rush of wind that swept down the stone chimney. The hearth fire flared wildly, turning from orange to a bright, crackling blue. Aveline screamed then, not from pain, but from the sheer raw effort of channeling the erratic, explosive magic tearing through her womb. The air pressure dropped so violently that Nesta's ears popped again. Static electricity arched across the heavy wooden beams of the ceiling, raising the fine hairs on Aveline's arms. Zephyr arrived in a chaotic burst of ozone and thunder. The moment the second twin cleared the birth canal, he let out a wail that sounded exactly like a cracking whip of lightning. The gust of wind that accompanied his first breath physically pushed Nesta backward, sending her medical satchel skittering across the floor. Zephyr was slightly smaller than his brother, but his energy was uncontrollable, his eyes a terrifying, turbulent, silver-clouded hue that sparked with latent elemental fury. Gideon's eyes. Nesta scrambled forward on her knees, completely terrified by the sheer magnitude of what she had just delivered. She reached into her boot and pulled out her most prized possession, a heavy iron blade, forged by the old covens, designed specifically to cut the umbilical cords of high-born shifters without transferring infection. She sliced the cords. The moment the cold iron separated the twins from their mother, the magic in the room stabilized, settling heavily into the two infants. The howling wind in the chimney died. The shadows retreated to the corners of the cabin. Nesta wiped the blood from the twins' backs, her breath catching in her throat. She stared down at the tiny, fragile shoulder blades of the newborns. "Mother of moons," the old woman whispered, her hands trembling violently. Aveline collapsed back against the furs, completely hollowed out, her body trembling with postpartum shock. Her scarred hands twitched. "What is it?" "They are marked," Nesta breathed, wrapping the infants in warm wool and holding them close to Aveline's face. Both of them. Aveline forced her heavy, exhausted eyelids open. There, glowing faintly against the pale skin of both boys' left shoulders, were intricate, swirling crests of pure magic. Kaelin's mark was pitch black, a vortex of shadow that seemed to swallow the light around it. Zephyr's mark was a brilliant, crackling silver, resembling a jagged bolt of lightning wrapped around a wolf's skull. Dual alpha marks, an absolute biological impossibility. A pack could only have one true alpha, one dominant soul born to command. To have two born from the same womb, carrying the ancient, volatile magic of the Thorn lineage and the ferocious blood of the Vance kings, was a cosmic declaration of war. They were not just heirs, they were apex predators wrapped in infant skin. Aveline reached out a trembling, blood-stained finger. She traced the black crest on Kaelin's shoulder, then the silver crest on Zephyr's. The phantom ache in her chest, the agonizing void left by Gideon's severed bond, finally fell quiet, entirely eclipsed a terrifying, all-consuming wave of maternal protective fury. "Conceal them," Aveline whispered to the roaring fire, her voice a lethal freezing vow. "Keep them hidden until they are strong enough to take it all." Outside, the wind howled across the frozen peaks, carrying the scent of snow and pine across the silent valley. 5 winters came and went, burying the past beneath mountains of unmelting snow. The passage of half a decade in the exiled wilderness was measured not by calendars, but by the thickening rings of the ancient pines and the slow, methodical accumulation of survival skills. The secluded cabin had evolved from a desperate shelter into a sprawling, heavily fortified stronghold. It was an architectural marvel of rogue engineering, completely invisible from the valley below, accessible only through a treacherous, winding goat path that Aveline had rigged with lethal deadfall traps. Inside, The environment was a stark, aggressive contrast to the freezing abyss outside. The air was thick and heavy, smelling intensely of roasting venison, drying lavender, and the sharp, clean scent of split cedar. The massive stone hearth dominated the central room, its fire roaring continuously, casting a warm, golden glow across the heavy fur rugs and hand-carved wooden furniture. This was their sanctuary, the ultimate sensory thaw. After years of freezing isolation, Aveline had become a master of the unseen. Her body had fully recovered from the catastrophic trauma of the premature birth, hardening into something lean, lethal, and permanently vigilant. Her dark hair was braided tightly against her scalp, and her movements possessed the silent, calculated economy of a woman who expected an ambush at every passing second. She no longer wore the delicate silks of a Luna. She wore heavy, boiled leather armor, her heavy iron blade, gifted by Nestor before the old midwife passed away peacefully in their third winter, strapped securely to her thigh. But her absolute focus, her entire reason for drawing breath, was centered entirely on the two dangerous figures currently standing in the center of the cabin's wooden floor. Kalen and Zephyr were only 5 years old by the calendar, but the rules of ordinary men did not apply to them. The heavy, volatile alpha blood in their veins, combined with the dormant magic of the Thorn lineage, had already driven them through their first shift at an impossibly young age. That primal transformation had drastically accelerated their physical development, demanding massive reserves of magic to forge dense bone and corded muscle. Now, they stood as tall as boys on the precipice of their teenage years, their young shoulders already broad and shaped with the unnatural musculature of adolescent wolves. They were terrifyingly beautiful, carrying the aristocratic, high-cheekboned features of Gideon Vance, yet hardened by the feral, untamed wildness of their mother's survival. It was a cruel irony that Gideon's royal blood ran so fiercely in the sons he did not know existed. Kalen stood perfectly still in the shadows near the back wall. His silver eyes, the exact mirrored reflection of Aveline's, were completely devoid of emotion. He was the silent brother, the brooding watcher. When he breathed, the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to stretch and pulse in tandem with his lungs. Zephyr, in contrast, was entirely incapable of stillness. He paced the length of the worn floorboards, his turbulent slate-colored irises sparking with latent chaotic energy. Every time his boot struck the floor, a faint crackle of static electricity arched across the wood. The wind outside the cabin seemed to howl in direct response to his agitation, violently rattling the thick wooden shutters. Again, Aveline commanded, her voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room. She sat on a low wooden bench, a long, unyielding iron oak log resting across her lap. It was a massive piece of timber, carved from the heartwood of a cursed tree, designed not for building, but for testing the absolute physical and mental restraint of the wielder. Zephyr stopped pacing. He turned, his jaw clenched, and snatched the heavy iron oak log from his brother's hands. He planted his boots, gripping the thick, unyielding wood. He pulled, attempting to snap it in half with pure brute force. The muscles in his back bunched and strained against his leather tunic. The log did not splinter. Zephyr's frustration flared, immediate and explosive. A sharp gust of wind materialized inside the sealed cabin, blowing the hearth fire sideways and sending a cloud of hot ash into the air. "Control it," Aveline snapped, standing up so fast the bench scraped harshly against the floor. She closed the distance between them, her silver eyes flashing with absolute authority. "If you lose your temper, you lose your cover. If you lose your cover, Sitzbila Frost's hunters will find us, and they will not hesitate to put a silver bolt through your heart." "Let them come," Zephyr snarled, the static electricity in his hair standing on end. "I can break their bones with the wind before they cross the tree line." "Arrogance is how predators die, Zephyr," Aveline said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. She reached out, her scarred hand wrapping over his knuckles, physically forcing him to lower the timber. "You are not a god. You are a boy with a target on your back. You must learn to be prey, so they do not hunt you." From the shadows, Kalen moved. He did not step forward. He simply appeared beside them, the darkness bending around his physical form like a liquid shroud. He reached out and took the iron oak log from Zephyr's rigid grip. Kalen did not use anger. He closed his silver eyes, his chest rising in a slow, calculated breath. The shadows in the room instantly rushed toward him, wrapping around his forearms, acting as a secondary set of spectral muscles. He twisted the thick wood. The cursed iron oak groaned in protest, bending inch by agonizing inch until the fibers finally began to snap under the immense pressure of